the original World Cup trophy, a very beautiful thing made by a Parisian jeweler called Abel Lafleur. And it went missing in Brazil in 1983, has never been found. I was giving a book talk in London to a room full of complete football fanatics, and I said, can anyone here tell me anything about the man? And nobody could.
Welcome to the American Library in Paris. Hi, I'm Rachel Donadio. I'm the curator of cultural programs here, and it is an honor and a pleasure and a delight to have Simon Kuper in conversation this evening with Darren Tulett about Simon's new book, World Cup Fever. How many of you are here at the library for the first time? Welcome, all of you. We are an independent nonprofit organization. We are the largest English language lending library on the European continent. We are a home for the thoughtful and curious, and we're glad to have you with us in our community this evening. Simon and Darren are going to be in conversation for about 45 minutes, at which point we will open it up to questions from you in the audience, and you should wait for a microphone to come around. I'm going to introduce the speakers. Before that, just please make sure that your phones are silenced so that you don't have to answer an important call during the conversation. I'm going to introduce Simon, friend of the library. Simon Kuper, born in Kampala, Uganda in 1969. You shouldn't put your age in anymore, I think. Is an author and Financial Times columnist. He is a British-French dual citizen and lives in Paris. His recent books include The Happy Traitor, his biography of the double agent George Blake, Barça, the rise and fall of the club that invented modern football, winner of Britain's Sunday Times Award for Football Book of the Year, Chums, how a tiny cast of Oxford Tories took over the UK, Impossible City, Paris in the 21st century, and World Cup Fever, a footballing journey in 9 tournaments. Simon, you write books faster than some people read them. Can we have a big round of applause for Simon? In conversation, here in this corner, we have Darren Tulett, born in 1965 in Brighton, near Brighton.
I told you 1965 is a scandalous.
On England's south coast. We're going to fact check this. After studying in Manchester, where his interests leaned more toward the city's football teams and thriving music scene than academia, he moved to Paris on a whim. Not speaking French, he began working as an English teacher, unwittingly launching what would become a long international career. Following a brief return to England, where he nabbed his first job as a sports columnist, Darren moved back to the French capital and wrote for Bloomberg News and The Guardian before transitioning to French television. After a decade with Canal Plus covering English football, he joined beIN Sports in 2012. He has since reported on major global sporting events from Wimbledon to the Olympic Games via the Tour de France, and he is currently looking forward to covering his 8th World Cup. Big round of applause for you, Darren.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Well, thank you very much. Half of that was true. You all know why you're here. You don't need me to introduce Simon to you, but I would just start by saying that even though he may deny it later, we have been friends for a long time. And obviously when you're friends with people, you don't always tell them exactly how much you like or admire what they do. So before we start, it's been a pleasure, Simon, to read you over the years since 1994 with your football against the enemy, of course, which is a recent
just republished, yeah, in a kind of 32 years later edition. Yes,
that's right, which was a remarkable work. And there you are. I'm already selling you another book before we even start about the book on the book that we're here for. But anyway, one of our most trusted, talented and singular voices on the sports writing world these days. And if you're here, it's because you agree with me. And we're very lucky to be here with you tonight, Simon. And congratulations on your book, World Cup Fever. You're getting ready to cover your 10th World Cup, if I remember correctly. Just told me that about a couple of seconds ago. And it is, of course, in the book. And before we start talking about some of the individual episodes of this wonderful book, perhaps we could just start with you telling everybody your first memories of a first World Cup.
I mean, I say in the book, everyone remembers their first World Cup. It's like post-Madeleine, and every new World Cup takes you back to your first if you care about it. And for me, it's 1978. I'm 8 years old. I'm living in the Netherlands, where I see friends from there. We had just moved shortly before for my dad's job in a small town, and I have become a Holland fan. Everyone around me in my classes. And it's the World Cup in Argentina run by a military regime. So a lot of the political turmoil around the World Cup is very, very old. And Holland reached the final. Of course they do. The second time in 4 years, that fantastic Dutch team with those very bright orange shirts. And I'm 8 years old, so I think it's completely normal that this small country where I happen to live is playing in the World Cup final. And one thing about World Cups is you see the people who you watched with, you can still see them because it's, you know, it was June 25th, 1978. So I know exactly who I was with and where I was that night. I was with my grandparents, long since dead, and my parents. My mother is long since dead. And so I still see us all sitting there. And then Holland equalized shortly before time. And in my memory, Dick Nonninga, who was a semi-professional, he had a flower shop in a small town. He heads the ball into top of the Argentinian net. And in my memory, the windows are open. It's a hot night, and all the other houses, you hear this sound of cheering rising. I don't know if that's true, but that's how I remember it. And it's part of, there's no more communal experience then and now than a World Cup, especially now when everybody is on their own device watching their own content. The World Cup is the one moment when a country like Holland or France or England, everyone is watching the same thing and feeling the same feelings. And goes to extra time and Argentina win. So at the time, I thought, well, Holland's going to win a World Cup, obviously. But now I'm 56 and I don't have many left, so I'm not sure I'll be there for it.
You never know, you never know. And your first World Cup in person then?
So 1990, I'm 20 years old. I'm a student in England and I'm in the college bar, as you do as a student. And this friend of mine comes up to me and he says, if you had tickets to the World Cup, would you go? And I'm thinking, you know, what is this? Of course I would go, but of course I don't have tickets to the World Cup. How would I have those? And he says to me, oh, I can get as many as we want. He said, I've got this mate, his dad works at Mars. Mars is a sponsor and they can't get rid of their tickets because it's 1990. So American clients of Mars don't care about a World Cup, don't know there's a World Cup. Asians don't care about the World Cup. Europeans are terrified, as you'll recall, because it's all going to be English hooligans. Yeah.
We have a few in the front row down here tonight.
And so he a couple of days later, he has tickets for us for 3 World Cup games, free from this bloke. And we can stay in the Mars guy's apartment in Milan because he's going away. So we get in my friend's car, we go to Dover, boat, sleep on the train. About 36 hours later, we arrive in Milan. The first game's just been played. This Cameroonian is walking through the streets of Milan waving a Cameroonian flag, which is when we realized Cameroon have beaten the world champions Argentina. And we go to 3 games. Oh, and to get into Italy was the real problem because we arrive at this tiny hill station, frontier kind of customs station, like you had in the days before Schengen. We have to get off the train and they look at our passports. And these 2 customs officials in the middle of nowhere, these 3 20-year-old English boys, and they look at my friend's passport and it says born Liverpool. And this is 5 years after the Heysel drama when Liverpool fans were involved in the killing of 39 Italians. And they confer and they say to us, you cannot come into Italy. We think you're hooligans. So anyway, long arguments ensued. We waved our student library cards. Eventually we talked our way into Italy. We got there. But that was kind of how unloved and small time the World Cup was then.
See how useful a library card can be. Huh? Nice plug. 1990, 4 years later, there was your first World Cup. Were you actually working at the World Cup?
Yeah, so ever since I've always worked. And in fact, 94 in the US, I'd just been hired by the Financial Times where I still work to this day. Any day, of course, the email could come that is no longer the case. But for now, I'm still there. And they'd hired me and the editors said to this guy who was coordinating what tiny World Cup coverage we had, because the Financial Times never very ahead of the game on sport. He said, oh, we've hired this young man, you should get him to write about the World Cup. So this bloke very reluctantly did. So I was already, my fast circles for the Financial Times were there. I was living in Boston, I was studying there, and I would go to the games in Foxborough, and I had this terrible job. So Foxborough is again the Boston Stadium. I had this job that was very unsuited to me. I was the spotter for ABC TV, which means that if a player did something like he gets a yellow card or he shoots or he falls over, they say, who's that? Who's that? The producer shouts through your headphones. And you have to instantly identify that person, you know, which in a game like, the Bolivian team, who are these people anyway? And my facial recognition skills are not strong. So in the first Argentina match, in about 5 minutes in, I misidentify this player. I say it's Balbo. And then the guy gets up and he looks at the camera and he has a different number and a different face. And the producer starts shouting at me. And so for the rest of the tournament, I hardly dare to say who anyone is except Maradona. And so that was a job to which I was totally unsuited. Other tournaments, thankfully, I've just written. I'll make the answers shorter from now on, I promise.
No, please don't. Please don't. We want them longer. 1994 then, with people shouting at you for misrepresenting the players, and apologies to any Bolivian supporters in the room. 1998 is a turning point in many ways for you. The tournament here in France. So on a journalistic level, perhaps you'd talk us through it, but also what it meant to you and what it woke up in you as a man as well.
Well, to quote Rick in Casablanca, it was never particularly my beloved Paris. So I found it a snobbish, rude city and grey and so on, which turned out all to be true, 30 years later. But anyway, I'd come from London where I worked for the Financial Times in an office where the windows didn't open. I sat in a suit and I wrote about the currency market. So life was pretty grey. And they let me go to France for a month to run around the country covering the World Cup. So I go around France, I'm in Lyon eating, andouillettes on Little Place. I'm in Marseille eating bouillabaisse by the swimming pool. It's all the cliches are true. And then I'm in Paris for a while and I suddenly start to get French life. I thought, right, every afternoon and every evening you eat out. It was then quite cheap. You have some wine, you have L'Équipe newspaper, and the sun shines. That's kind of French life. And I thought, wow, this is just the best life in the world. And I went back to London. About a month later, I resigned my job. I just couldn't face sitting in an office in London writing about currencies. 3 years later, I bought a very cheap apartment in Paris, and then I tried living there, and I never left. So yeah, the World Cup '98 changed my life.
In more ways than some of us could imagine.
Yes, change other people's lives too, yes. Yeah. And made certain people's, yeah.
So as we go through... Oh, I should use it. Guy off TV doesn't know how to use a microphone. I wanted to just linger on the 1998 French World Cup for a couple of reasons. First of all, because of the social impact that's around that final. I mean, we remember being there and covering it. It was my first World Cup as a journalist as well. And that fabulous night. Were many of you here in 1998? Did you also participate in the street parties? Yeah, it was quite remarkable, wasn't it? It felt like the country was perhaps changing in some way because they had not just the liberté, égalité, and all that kind of stuff. We had the black, blanc, bleu, beurre.
It was going to herald a new, I think Chirac, the president, said it's a multicultural France and a France that wins. It was going to end racism and it was going to kill the far right. That was what people were saying.
Yeah. And did you believe it at the time, Simon?
I like writing about football and politics. As you say, my first book was about that. So I was very interested in that idea. I didn't really know France well enough to have a strong view on that. But that was what a lot of people were writing. How could you hate immigrants when Zidane was the hero of the World Cup, when Lilian Thuram was the kind of most impressive person in the French team? And so, I've since learned football doesn't change the world at all. It just casts a light on it. So Les Bleus, the national team, is a very important device for French people to debate race and what is France. And every national team is a device for people to debate what is our nation. Because when you see the England team or the France team or the US team, those 11 young men in plastic shirts, they are an incarnation, an embodiment of the nation. With all its strengths, its beauty, and its flaws, and the things you like about your country you don't like. So in Brazil, for a long time, the debate was, well, Brazil is a creative country, but it's not an organized country, and that was kind of reflected in the football team. In France now, of course, the debate is, should we not be a white country? That's a debate that the far right leads around the team, and never in so many words, but that's the subtext.
Zizou, président, as they flashed up on the Arc de Triomphe that night.
I was in a cafe at Opera until dawn with German journalists who were a bit sheepish. But for me, thinking back, it was like 1944. It was the biggest street party since 1944, with the difference that in 1998, all French people were on the same side.
Indeed. There was also a bit I like at the beginning of the book, Jules Rimet. Perhaps you could tell us about that, because his team, because he was one of the founders of the Red Star team, which is why there are still a couple of seats empty, because Red Star are playing tonight, of course, in a very important playoff match against Rodez, as we'll be keeping you up to date with the scores as they go along.
Yeah, so most people who like World Cups in soccer have heard the name Jules Rimet, because he gave his name, eventually, the original World Cup trophy, a very beautiful thing made by a Parisian jeweler called Abel Lafleur, a sculptor, was named after Rimet. It's the Coupe Jules Rimet. And it went missing in Brazil in 1983, has never been found. But I was giving a book talk in London to a room full of complete football fanatics. And I said, can anyone here tell me anything about the man? And nobody could. And I didn't know anything about the man. So who was this guy who was president of FIFA for over 30 years? He founds the World Cup. He gets it started in 1930. And I cycled out to the graveyard somewhere in the banlieue where he is buried. And I find his grave. It takes me half an hour, although I have a map. And you look at the grave of the family, it's clear nobody has been here in at least 10 years. Probably the family has died out. And there's a little gold plaque on it that says Jules Rimet, gives his dates, nothing about him. So who was this guy? So I went back and I found he was 4 years, and he was a poor boy from the peasant background in eastern France, comes to Paris, very near here in the 7e. His parents run a grocery, and he's clever. He studies law. He founds EDSA. And then he becomes a football official. And then he goes to World War I. He's 41. He has a wife and 3 children, but he goes to World War I. He seems to have volunteered in August 14. And he spent 4 years at the front. It's amazing that he survived. He won the, I think, the Croix de Guerre 3 times. You know, he was machine gun fire. He invents this object that helps them win the war. And then he comes back from the war, becomes president of FIFA. And like many people he took from the war, the only thing that matters is peace, especially peace between France and Germany. And so the World Cup, which was an old FIFA idea since they were founded in 1904, he makes it happen, and it's going to bring peace between nations. And so when the second is in Italy in 1934 with Mussolini, his view is, well, you don't dislike people or countries just because they're fascist. We all have our different cultures, and we have to bring peace. And so he goes to Germany in 1936. He campaigns for the Berlin Olympics to not be boycotted. And in World War II, he gets into trouble because right at 6 weeks after war is declared in 1939, he goes to this meeting in Zurich for FIFA, which is then based in Zurich. They had to leave. They were originally based in Amsterdam, but moved out when the treasurer lost all their money. He was a Dutchman. He lost all FIFA's money in the crash of 1929. So they moved to Zurich. So anyway, last thing I'll say about him, he goes to this meeting in Zurich, FIFA, and there are 2 Germans there. And one of them he hadn't expected. He's kind of ambushed. And they all talk football, and the Germans say, oh, wouldn't it be nice if, we have more Italians on the board of FIFA? Because the Germans spent a lot of the war trying to take over FIFA. He comes back to France. He's called in straight away by the head of the French police, the Sûreté. And he says, Monsieur Rimet, you just went to Germany 6 weeks after the war began. You met Germans. So he gets into very deep water. He then collaborates with Vichy. He comes out. He's fine. Everyone forgets about it. And when he dies in 56, FIFA have nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize.
It's quite a remarkable story. And it's funny also to think that us Brits, we like to think that we invented all of the sports, even though we're hardly the best at any of them anymore.
I never interrupt you, but the Brits do. So nobody invents football or most sports. People are kicking balls for centuries. The Brits codify them, but they don't see the point in playing against other countries.
Why would we?
Why would we? So the French say, well, obviously one nation must take the lead in creating international sports, and it can only be La France. So the French create the Tour de France, they create the modern Olympics, create the World Cup, they create international motorsports. Obviously, it has to be done from Paris because you can't trust foreign people to do that.
Absolutely. How right they were. Still with this idea, just to finish with 1998, and then we'll move on. But as a man who also wrote the book, Why England Lose.
Well, we renamed it Soccernomics because it turned out English people wouldn't buy a book that was called Why England Lose. So. Unforeseen.
Sadly.
Our sales in Scotland, it was a bestseller, yeah.
So it started out as Why England Lose, talking about the football team. We won't go into that because it's 60 years of suffering. But why did France suddenly start winning, do you think? Because before 1998, for some of you younger people here who are just spoilt by the French football success.
There won't be many young people here. This is a library.
Well, apart from your kids, perhaps. Yeah. Hi. How did France suddenly turn into a soccer powerhouse?
You remember they did have that spell in the 80s when they had this wonderful team, and they didn't do it at World Cups. So what happens with France is the banlieue. So the French elite is very anti-football. So if you remember the 400 coups by Truffaut, there's this gym teacher who forces the kids to play football. It's one of these terrible things that adults do to children, forces them into this kind of military-style game. Le Monde, they had, I think, a weekly sports article for decades, for the first few decades of their existence. And the guy who wrote it he wrote it from this little kind of wardrobe, this 8 square meter room. That was where they put the sports department. Only in 1995 does Le Monde start a daily sports page. So this was an elite that thought that football was ridiculous and lower class. And the only places in France where you had a football tradition were the industrial cities and the port town of Marseille. So Marseille, Nantes, Saint-Etienne, that's about it. And then over the post-war decades, especially from the 60s, the banlieue just grow and grow. People come in from the French provinces. They come in from mostly African countries, Portugal. And there you don't have these taboos about football being this low thing. They build sports complexes. And gradually, the French Federation and kind of official France realizes, hey, they're these banlieues. We haven't given them any transport links, but they exist. And now there's a couple of millions of people suddenly, and they have football fields. And I think in 98, it's the first time anyone had scouted anyone from there. So in 98, they win with Thuram, Vieira, and Thierry Henry, who are all boys from the banlieue. And then in the 21st century, the Paris banlieue are now the biggest talent pool in global football. So it's not just French players like Mbappe, Pogba, Matuidi, Kante, but you also have whole African national teams, Algeria, Senegal, Morocco, not entirely, but several, are staffed by kids from the banlieue of Paris. My son's favorite coach from their childhood, he now plays for Mali. He's a Parisian kid who plays for Mali because everyone who plays for Mali is a Parisian kid. So the incredible talent of the banlieue transforms French football.
I'm going to jump ahead a little bit now to 2010 because that's part of the book that I most enjoyed reading. It's also something which I enjoy about the way that you go about telling your story, Simon, because you managed to mix the personal and the politics of things so well. 2010 was obviously a very special tournament because the first ever held on the African continent, and it had a particular meaning for you as well.
Yeah, so both my parents were born and raised in Johannesburg, left, never really returned. But we would always visit family. Even during apartheid, we'd go in, the European winter when we had enough money, we'd fly there, and then I'd be in my grandparents' swimming pool in Johannesburg the next morning, and then the maid would serve us chocolate cake on the veranda. And as a 9-year-old, you think, like my friend Adrian here, we lived in this very dull street in Leiden. It was very pleasant. Nothing really ever happened. And it was always cold, and everything was organized, and it was social democracy. And then suddenly you're at the bottom of the world in this society where, hang on, my grandparents' maid lives behind the garage in these dank rooms, and a lot of her grandchildren live there with her. How does this work? What is going on? It was so unlike anything of my daily life. And so I saw apartheid up close. Like most people who saw that, it registered with me, I think, as a stronger memory than anything else in my childhood. Kept going back, and then after apartheid also, it was about when I started writing journalism. I started to go back as a journalist, wrote about it. And then the 2010 World Cup. You see, what South Africa had to do after 94, after the transition, was one of the tasks was to create a nation. Because actually my great-uncle Leo Kuper, who was a sociologist, wrote about South African football when nobody else did. And Leo in the 50s writes about sports and especially soccer, and he says, you can't have a South African national team because the South African nation is understood by the ruling party and the whites only to include white people. So Nelson Mandela in the 50s does not count as a South African. And so Leo said you could have a black team or you could have a white team that is chosen to represent that is cast as representing South Africa, but there is no such thing as a South African identity. And then Mandela has to create a nation, and he does it partly through sports. So you'll remember the Rugby World Cup of '95, where he and the Afrikaner captain Francois Pienaar, when South Africa win that first World Cup in Joburg, it's an amazing experience with 14 white players, 1 non-white. Mandela comes onto the field wearing the Springbok jersey, which had been a symbol of whiteness. And he says to the massive white captain, Pienaar, he says, Francois, thank you for what you did for the country. And Pienaar says, no, Mr. Mandela, this is all in microphones, whole stadium. Thank you for what you did for the country. In the stadium, 80,000 white South African Boers isn't a dry eye in the stadium. And this is a kind of nation-building moment. The next year, they win the Nations Cup football. Mandela dances on the field. Of course, Mandela's a very good dancer, wearing the shirt of the white captain. And so the World Cup 2010 it's sort of part of this nation building, but it's already too late because the nation has been built. One of the beautiful things about South Africa, I was there in February, is the inequality is the highest in the world. It's also a very violent society, but everybody, I think, pretty much accepts that everybody else is South African. It's an amazing achievement. So there's very little kind of one settler, one bullet, to quote a 60s slogan. Very little get the whites out. The maid and the madam both view each other as South African and having their place there. It's something very beautiful. And in daily life, people deal with each other with enormous respect, which my dad, I was back there with him in February, he said it was unthinkable 50 years ago that white men would speak to black women with respect. And that now happens. So nation building was done. 2010, the promise in the end was it will bring you jobs. The tourism, foreign investment will pour in. It was all lies and nonsense. And the population so badly wanted to believe it. So anyway, I won't go on because South Africa I find a very too emotional a subject to talk about for long.
I understand, and that's part of the book which if you haven't read it yet, which you'll very much enjoy. Perhaps we can just jump on what you just said though about the lies or the stories that are involved, the myths involved in staging or wanting to stage a World Cup, because we're going to come up against that this summer with the World Cup in 3 different countries. What a fantastic idea, with 48 nations and 104 games, bloated competition. But tell us a little bit about, because also, it's another thing that you speak about in Soccernomics, if I remember correctly, but the whole idea of hosting a World Cup is going to be good for you. In South Africa, it was really quite stark, wasn't it? How much of a disappointment that was to local people.
Yeah, well, South Africa, unlike the US, had to build world-class stadiums. And because South Africans' great anxiety was not being world-class, was a sense of inferiority towards the developed nations of Europe, they really built world-class stadiums. And these are now unused because there's only 2 teams in South Africa that draw fans. So I was at one of these world-class stadiums in the poor town of Polokwane, and it's like having this spaceship in, kind of poor provincial town in the middle of nowhere. And you're there's 50,000 seats, 3,000 people. So yeah, there's an enormous amount of waste. Brazil did the same thing. So usually the story told is, yeah, this could be great for the economy. You heard it with the US this time as well. All these foreign visitors are going to fly in. They're going to spend a lot of money. And it's always disappointing. It was the same here in Paris, actually, before the Olympics. Everyone was going to Airbnb their home and they were going to make an incredible amount of money. Prices plunged so low that one Dutch friend of mine came in the second week of the tournament just for a Paris holiday because Airbnbs here were so cheap at that point. So it's always disappointing. The crowd at World Cups is always overwhelmingly the home country. That will be particularly true in the most expensive country in the world, the United States, which is hard to get to and unwelcoming. So there's always a disappointment and you get a displacement of tourism. So New York in June or July, or LA June, July, but LA, these cities get visitors. A lot of people want to go to Boston or New York at this time of year. Those people are going to say, hey, I'm not going to go this June or July because there's a World Cup. There'll be too many people, prices, security hassles. So you lose a huge amount of tourists and you don't gain very many. And we're seeing that dynamic now in the US. Rachel and I were talking about it just now, that the hotels are complaining, they're empty, the Airbnb people haven't made their money.
Simon, just a couple of general questions before we open it up for your questions, if you have any. I'm wondering which was the World Cup that you most enjoyed working at?
Yeah, I went through all my old notebooks because I've been keeping my notebooks since 98. And I say very clearly, black on white, Brazil was the best World Cup because Brazilians are lovely people to be around. Actually, as you know, if you live in Paris and you go anywhere, people everywhere seem really welcoming, but Brazilians even more so. And they have beaches. And their winter weather is nicer than our summer weather. And also, you have to have a World Cup in a country where people care about the World Cup. Now, in Brazil, they don't really care about the World Cup. They care about one team in the World Cup. And everyone else is allowed to play. And obviously, Brazil was going to win at the end. But I'd been, in France in 98. As you'll remember, not many people cared then. Japan, the US in 94, you feel you're kind of moving between these tiny islands of people who know what it's all about. So in Boston, I used to go to this bar and you'd walk in and that was where the World Cup was. And there were Nigerians and Bulgarians and Mexicans and Moroccans and everybody had exactly the same information levels, extreme information. And you went out the door and there was no more World Cup because in the US in 94, there was practically no World Cup.
I enjoyed being in Korea for that one. The Koreans were kind of crazy about the World Cup.
Yeah. You were in Korea. I was in Japan. The Japanese were less into it. Yeah.
Lots of Koreans because Korea had never won a match at the World Cup, and suddenly they're hosting the tournament with Japan in 2002, and they win their first game. Then they get another one. Dutch manager, of course. Always an explanation for these things. And it was kind of crazy, the atmosphere there. You know, people would wait for us foreigners in the streets and say things like, English, yes. David Beckham, yes. Beer, yes. And then we'd follow them to where the beer was because David Beckham was already there. So that was a fun World Cup. And what about as a journalist? How has covering the World Cup evolved since the first tournament that you were at?
Well, you know, this French view of life that everything gets worse. Well, if you're a journalist, it's really true because we used to sell newspapers and you had to advertise in newspapers because there was no Google or Facebook. So if you had a hotel chain, you put the ad in the newspaper. Now, of course, nobody would do that. So I remember in 98, we had a website. The FT in 98 had a website, my newspaper, but nobody looked at it and we never did anything for it. And so you'd file your last story at about 6 p.m. And then, as they say, at 7, the paper would close. And so you couldn't get in anything more, you know. So at 7, you were done. And even if something really massive happened, well, you know, who cares? And so you'd go out for dinner with your fellow journalists and everyone would be able to charge it to expenses because newspapers had expenses then. And so fast forward 2014 in Brazil, I'm walking through a media center and everyone has their head down and is bashing away on their laptop. And what are these people doing? Everything is websites now, paying 30 euros a story. And so I had colleagues who would write 5 or 6 stories a day for, 30 euros each. And then they would hope that paid for their hotels and food. That's kind of what happened to journalism. If you're not a journalism, there's enormous decimation of jobs. I think in the last 20 years, 2/3 of US newspaper journalists lost those jobs disappeared because you now get all your stuff free online.
We did have a few nice meals in Qatar, thanks to the generosity of our employers.
We had a couple of meals. I was working massively hard to the end. You probably weren't though.
TV guys, swan around on expenses.
Yeah, TV is different. But also you were effectively the host broadcaster. We did have a nice time by that pool in your hotel. Yeah.
Yes, photos will be available on request later.
My hotel or the executive suites where I was staying did not have a pool, by the way.
Yeah, very disappointing. Simon, also, let's project onto this World Cup coming up then. It's going to be your 10th.
Yep.
What are you expecting from it? Are you looking forward to it? Are you a bit circumspect about the whole thing? What are you thinking?
Right, so having done 10 means you know the cycle. And so everyone is now saying to me, it's horrible, we should boycott, I don't feel like it, FIFA Peace Prize, ticket prices, all of which is true and fair enough. And I know that, well, until now, the day the tournament starts, people stop talking about Putin or how construction workers died in Qatar, and they say, wow, did you see that ball in that top corner? Do you remember, was it Chabalala in 2010, that South African who in the first game he puts the ball in the top corner against Mexico? The whole world is talking about it. And from then on, people are saying, did you see that Suarez bit that guy? And did you see that banner in the crowd, like Scotland, Soviet Union, 1982, alcoholism versus communism? Did you see this and that? And can you believe that they haven't sacked the coach? And everybody is going to forget about Trump and Infantino. And I think it's right, because we should be talking about the bad things in the world and the bad people in the world. And we should be talking about everything that's wrong in the US, and we do that all the time. But we should also then stop and say, look, this is the world's biggest party. Everybody is invited. Doesn't matter if your country's playing or not. Doesn't matter what your religion or color is. We're all talking about the same things. Within a country, Everyone is united, watching the same stuff, talking about it with everyone. In Soccernomics, we show suicides in a European country decline when that country is playing in a World Cup, because even lonely people get dragged into the national conversation. So this is this wonderful event. At the end of the book, I speak to this Anglican vicar who wrote a book about the theology of sport. And I said, what is the World Cup? And he said, a World Cup is like a religious feast, like Easter or Eid or Passover, but for the whole world. He says, everyone is invited. And what is a religious feast? It's a time to escape the drudgery of life and the difficulties and just to feel happiness and share and enjoy.
And yet, Simon, the level of the football is not really...
Yeah, so that's why I was hesitant, because normally on day one, everyone's talking about that. But now you have a first round, which is like sort of the NBA regular season, where it doesn't matter, you know, England or Germany are going to have to work incredibly hard not to qualify. It's almost impossible for them not to qualify. So for the first 2 or 3 weeks...
Hats off to the Italians who didn't even bother. Didn't bother.
I mean, what Italy did is amazing. But actually, not qualifying in Europe is easier than not qualifying when you're playing against teams like Jordan and Curacao, because we are in the best region of football in the world, leaving aside Leo Messi. And so for 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to see a lot of bad and boring teams. And I've just been writing about the dramas of Curacao, Dutch territory, 150,000 people in the Caribbean, the smallest place ever to qualify for a World Cup, exclusively boys born in the Netherlands of Curacao origin. And they just sack their coach and replace him with someone else. But yeah, they just want to defend. They just want to not lose 8-0 against Germany. So you're going to see a lot of really, really bad football where you think, how come these people are on television?
Often what people think when they see me. Are you looking forward to any game in particular or any team in particular for this World Cup?
So I always think about Holland, but more in hope than expectation this time. The French attack, I mean, for those of you who are kind of looking for a quick TV guide, essentially their front 4 players are Kylian Mbappe, Ousmane Dembele, Mikel Olise, and behind them, Ryan Cherki, which I think is probably the most exciting 4 front players of any team in a World Cup since Brazil in 1970. I mean, it's going to be astonishing. France always play boring football. It's always a pain to watch. And somehow Didier Deschamps, the coach, will make it that. But these guys, it's just incredible. It's mind-boggling. England have a decent team, as you know. Yeah, I mean, how did this happen? It happened because they started to copy the Europeans. And that's now England produces these kind of pocket mini players who can play football and pass and understand. The thing about football you have to understand is football is a dance in space. It's about opening space when you have the ball, closing it when you don't. So football is geometry. Johan Cruyff, the Dutchman who invented modern football, says football is a game you play with your head. Very few countries have worked this out, but England has now joined that select group.
Johan Cruyff only played in 1 World Cup when you think about it. So,
yeah. Well, he didn't go to Argentina because there had been an attempted kidnapping at his house in Barcelona the year before. He was a chain smoker. He was 31. He was in decline. He didn't want to leave his family. His wife had given him a very hard time for a headline in a German newspaper the day of the 74 final, which ran Cruyff, Champagne and Naked Girls. And so he couldn't face another World Cup. He commentates the 1978 final Holland-Argentina in the ITV studio in England. He's the kind of expert commentator. And you can see him during the match thinking, I really wish I'd gone. Yeah.
Cruyff, Champagne and Naked Girls.
Yes.
Also the title of his autobiography.
Very much not.
Very much not. Okay, just to finish then, 10th World Cup coming up. How many have you set your sights on? How many more?
Well, I look at the people leading the field. So a friend of mine told me in Qatar there was this 92-year-old Argentinian, and he started in 1958. But this guy, my friend said, yeah, but by Qatar, he wasn't really watching the World Cup. He was just kind of sitting in the back of the room on his chair, just hoping to survive. So, yeah, well, my role model, in 94, I saw this old Uruguayan being led through the media centers as a celeb, Diego Lucero. And in 1994, he was the only man in the world who'd been to every World Cup since 1930. So every World Cup that had been played at that point. He then died. So, but anyway, I hope to...
He died at the World Cup?
No, he died shortly after. 94 was his last stand.
Okay. Let's hope you're not going to...
Yeah, so I'm aiming for that kind of eminence.
Don't go kicking a bucket at the World Cup, Simon.
No. Although we know people who did.
Yeah. And it's always fascinating to run into the people who have been there. For Brian Glanville in 1998.
And he wouldn't stop talking to you about it. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
I was it was my first World Cup, and he'd already told his story to everybody else, so they were all laughing.
No, I mean, he was a fantastic raconteur, but he didn't never stop raconteuring. Yeah,
He's a fantastic storyteller. Okay, just like yourself, Simon, n'est-ce pas? Many more of those stories in the book World Cup Fever, and the good news is there are just a few of the copies that have not yet been sold, still available for you if you haven't got your hands on them yet. And if you want them to decrease in value, Simon will sign them for you afterwards.
There was this thing about questions from the audience.
Yes. Did you want to add anything that I might have missed out on that you wanted to tell people?
You missed out so much. No, I do buy the book. You could also buy my other book, Soccernomics and World Cup Fever, which are Football Against the Enemy, which have also just been reissued. Soccernomics, totally updated, incredible.
That's right. I was going to say that, but you took the words right out of my mouth.
Questions? I'll come around with the mic.
Don't be shy.
Thanks, Darren and Simon. Very interesting. Simon, I have a question about the France team, 1998. You said that's the first time they really sort of the football in France sort of became a big thing. But the 1982 team was one of the most spectacular teams we've seen in World Cup history in France. Was that just a fluke? What happened there? Was there anything going on in France like this unites the country? I don't remember many African-born players there in that team. But
it was. So I interviewed Eric Cantona, who himself is issu de l'immigration. He was a great French player whose grandparents had come from Sardinia and refugees from Republican Spain, and he said, French football is made by immigrants in every generation. So in the 30s, it was people of Southern European origin. There was also a famous, I think, Arab origin player called Ben Barak from North Africa. And so it's always that. And you did have a couple of great black players in the early 80s as well. You had Marius Trésor, Jean Tigana, but they all came from somewhere else. So Platini, who was the kind of leader of that team, his father had immigrated from Italy. So you always have a tradition of football in France. It's just not as good as, say, Italy or Germany or even Holland. It was not a front rank country until in the 80s they make it happen at one European Championship. So what happens, I think, is the quantity of immigration becomes bigger. And the other thing is that we've had a collapse of high-low culture. So we used to have a very stark divide between high culture is opera and low culture is football. And low culture was seen as bad, especially in Paris, and especially by the people who set the kind of tone for the country, who try and impose Parisian culture on French people. And that sort of starts to collapse in the 90s everywhere, in the 60s in the US. And so football becomes okay. So now you see people wearing football shirts in Paris. You see people talking about football in Paris. You see Le Monde having long articles. So all that has changed. And then the size of the banlieue, so the banlieue of Paris, without the city itself, are the biggest city in Europe. It's about 8 million people in the banlieue, depending on how you count. Biggest city in the European Union without this tiny bit in the middle. So I would say that is the change, the advance.
If I can just bounce back on that as well, because I remember very clearly that one of these moments you're talking about, the high-low thing. Do you remember these images in the stadium before the 1998 World Cup final? Jacques Chirac is the president, and the speaker in the stadium is reading out the names as they do. And the speaker says, and number 3, Bichente, and the whole stadium shouts out, Lizarazu! And of course, Jacques Chirac has no idea what any of the players are called. So you can look back at the images now, when he says, number 4, Laurent, and everyone's like going, Blanc. And the French president is just like a song you don't know the words to. He's like just mouthing words, He's like,
yeah. Whereas now, to the contrary, Macron is, of course, very versed in high culture and philosophy and theatre, but he makes an effort to emphasize his football love. So he's always talking about how he's a Marseille fan. In Africa this week, he's filmed wearing the France football shirt, because now high culture has actually, for most of the population, become weirdly low status or a sign that you're not a nice person.
Yes.
Thank you both. Simon, if I heard you correctly, you said you have to have the World Cup in a country where people care about the World Cup. That's not something I would say is true about the United States, maybe even Qatar as well. And in addition, with the increase in the number of teams that they have playing, it's starting to feel very much less like a world party and much more like a financial engine. And I'm just wondering how you view that and how you anticipate that things could potentially change the nature of the game on a global level because of this.
It's very much that they've allowed US sporting culture to capture this World Cup, and FIFA was delighted about that. So, I mean, a New York friend of mine says, if you want to watch the New York Knicks, the basketball team, courtside, that's thousands of dollars. He says for Americans, wealthy Americans, it's not weird to pay thousands of dollars to go to a World Cup. There's a very good David Leonard piece in the New York Times. He says, look, 3% of the US population has very high incomes and is able to spend on nice holidays, nice meals, that kind of thing. And he says it makes sense for every business in the US to orient itself to selling to those 3%, because those are the people with enormous disposable income. You don't want to be trying to sell to the bottom half of the US population who want the cheapest thing possible. And so that's kind of what's happened to the World Cup. I don't think it's going to damage the World Cup long term. It's damaged this World Cup. But also, I think what's crucial is I'm at the World Cup. Almost nobody's at the World Cup. The World Cup is a TV event. So for people in Shanghai or in Lusaka, or even people who live in Manchester, they don't really expect ever to go to a World Cup. They might have a dream that one day they will, but they experience the World Cup with their friends and family in their home or in a local cafe. And that's great. That really is what it is. You're not meant to be in the stadium. And when you're in the stadium, actually, because as I say, it's mostly a home crowd, the experience is usually underwhelming because the people there are not really fans of either team. So they don't know. So in Japan, you're watching Croatia, Nigeria, and there's maybe 2,000 people in the stadium who would give, their right foot for their team to win that game. And then there's 50,000 Japanese people who are watching sort of uncomprehendingly. That's the normal experience at a World Cup. But then on TV, you're shown those 72 Nigerians cheer when their team scores. And you think, wow, this is a real kind of buzzing, cauldron. And it's not.
Can't wait for Uzbekistan against Colombia at 3 a.m.
Yeah, but the great thing about the US, though, is that those people all live in the country. So all the 48 teams, except Qatar, have large populations living in the US. So you don't need to import them.
Hey, I guess a related question. I guess in following, being really into soccer since the South Africa World Cup, actually, club soccer as well. American, that's why I'm calling it soccer.
Soccer is fine and is actually an upper class English contraction word.
That's right. I did look up that to defend myself as well. It's proliferated the availability of being able to watch soccer and the number of games and the number club games, competitions. Do you see that happening with the World Cup? I guess because there was a proposal to even have it every 2 years instead of every 4 years. Do you think the specialness of the World Cup is declining over time because it's so easy? There's so much media exposure, and maybe even they'll have more games and it will become less special.
Well, FIFA would like it to be kind of every month, because FIFA has one money-making property. It's the Men's World Cup. And so they make 11 billion this time, which is more than they ever before, but they have to spread that over 4 years. And they have to essentially give it to the 200 national soccer federations to buy their votes. And the clubs own the players, or they contract the players. Clubs don't want the World Cup. They prefer there never to be a World Cup. So FIFA has done this thing where they've expanded it to 48. You create more content, you sell the rights for a bit more, and it is going to weaken it. So I think if you're used to watching Bayern Munich or Paris Saint-Germain, and you watch Uzbekistan or about 15 or 20 teams at this World Cup, you're not really going to understand what you're seeing. You're going to be thinking, what? These people are paid to play soccer? And so when we were kids, the World Cup was great players, and Peru would show up in 78 with this guy, Teofilo Cubillas. You'd never heard of him. And he was brilliant. And he played somewhere in Peru. And you'd never see him again. He was incredible. And that doesn't happen now. All the best players, they play in Western Europe. We see them on TV already. And Uzbekistan doesn't have them. So there are way too many teams for the quality, and there are no surprises because you already know who the best players in the world are. So yeah, it's devalued, but it's still the World Cup.
Question in the front row here. Neil.
A related question. It's going to take place in 3 countries: Mexico, Canada, and the United States, which are very different countries with different cultures and views of soccer, as we call it. That's the first thing. The difference, the way it's going to be hosted and welcomed in those countries. And the second angle of that is this World Cup being held in the United States because FIFA wants the US to buy into soccer economically in the way that they've clearly bought into football? Because when we talk about football and you talk about the football franchises in the US, they're worth many times more than most of the soccer clubs over here. So the economic and hosting element.
So the 3 countries, it's not really a World Cup in 3 countries, I would say. It's a World Cup in 1 country with a few games in Canada and Mexico. So when I wanted to go to Mexico. I've never been there. I'd love to. And you look and they don't have good games, and they kind of Mexico and Canada disappear by the quarterfinals. There's virtually nothing there anymore. So it's a World Cup in the US very largely. Now, I remember 94. It's one of the few advantages of being old. And that was that same rhetoric. The US is this untapped market for soccer, and the World Cup will put soccer on the map in the US. And soccer is now on the map in the US. So Americans who care about soccer, it's about equal with baseball as the number 3 popular sport. Football number 1, then basketball, and then soccer and baseball in terms of popularity. Soccer bigger among young people. And, the US doesn't have a proper league. It has a tin pot league, but Americans watch the Premier League, they watch Mexican soccer, they watch soccer from the country they're in. The women's soccer there is bigger arguably than in other countries still, but still there's much more of it. College soccer, 5-a-side. It's just, there's this whole mosaic of American soccer, which is not really going to change much as a result of this World Cup. It's already there. So and the thing is, what FIFA should be doing is exactly that. They should be taking the game to new markets, you could call it, or countries. So they should say, okay, where is the growth for soccer? Well, the growth for soccer is India, China, and Indonesia. These are 3 of the 4 biggest countries in the world, and they're just starting to switch on. So what FIFA should do is go to India and say, look, you're going to have the World Cup, and you're going to have to build 20 stadiums, and we will help you. We're going to get $11 billion from all the income, and we'll put that in, and you put money in, and we'll have a World Cup in India, and it will grow soccer in India because there's enormous room for growth. But they don't do that. They kind of have this corrupt bidding process and see who pays their executive members the most money.
Any more? Yes. A couple down here. Big man over there afterwards.
Hi, Simon. Thank you very much for all of that. I was just wondering, it was funny what you said before about how the World Cup really takes place at home. And now you're going to your 10th World Cup. And so I was wondering if you feel like you're missing out, and if it's like just work, or you're happy being there.
It's almost as if you've read the book, because in 2018, when my children were just old enough to really get into the World Cup, and France was great. France was winning. So they watched France-Argentina with friends, and everyone had pizza and the friends' parents, and they had their faces painted, and there was face paints all over the walls afterwards, and France won 4-3 in this amazing game against Argentina. And I was watching in Moscow. I wasn't at that game, but I was watching in a hotel bar with 2 friends, and it was very sedate, and we saw a brilliant game, and it was very, nice to watch good football. And I realized the World Cup happens in the living room. That's where most of the passion is. And I'm usually sitting alone, or actually more accurately sandwiched between 2 very fat other journalists, trying to kind of push each other away, people I don't know, and exhausted.
I was just going to say people like Darren for a second. Did you feel that as well? Okay.
Well, I'd love to sit next to you at the World Cup, but you're a TV journalist, which is a lower species. So they have their own compound, do you think what we call it? Yeah.
Indeed. Fair enough.
And,
fair comment, actually.
And so I also watch games that I don't particularly care about. For 90% of my World Cup games are games like, Paraguay, Japan, 0-0 in Pretoria, where I'm just thinking I'm freezing cold and why is anyone watching this and can I go home now? So yeah, and now this World Cup, for various reasons, I'm home for the first week. And I'm really looking forward to watching some games with friends. I've never watched a World Cup game with friends for 40 years, in the place where I live.
We had a question, maybe a couple more. Man in the orange shirt and then a man with the nice glasses over there.
Hi, Simon. I have two questions. They're related. One is, why do you think it's been so long since Holland hasn't produced a world-class centre forward?
Yeah, do you recognise what the orange shirt is, by the way?
And the second question, who do you think should play that position this year?
Dutch football is overcoached. And so our last great creative player was this guy, Arjen Robben. And he'd grown up in a village, I think. I'd never really heard of it in any other context. In Eastern Groningen, middle of nowhere. Nowhere in Holland is the middle of nowhere, but, it's a long way from Amsterdam. And obviously he was the only kid in the village who could play. So they said to him, when you get the ball, just dribble and score goals. And that essentially was his game for the rest of his life. And in the kind of overcoached, heavily coached, brilliantly coached Dutch system, I remember from childhood, the shout from the touchlines, don't dribble, niet pingelen, don't dribble. And so you had to play as a kind of member of the team all the time. It's very fast passing. And when Robben would be running through defenses at World Cups, and all the 5 Dutch players would be running alongside him going, here I am, give me the ball. You could see it was exactly that same dynamic. Don't dribble. And so if you don't allow any kind of soloistic expression, then you end up with no centre forwards, which is the sad Dutch situation. Yeah, Cruyff would say, we don't have a good centre forward, so we're going to play without a centre forward. That will fool them.
I wanted to know which Dutch player you would like to see playing centre forward for this World Cup.
In football, you should always ask, what would Johan say? And Johan would say,
okay,
if we don't have a good centre forward, we don't play a centre forward.
Fair enough. Poor old Gekpo is not going to be playing, apparently. And over here, Stuart.
So, I think we're similar age, so growing up the World Cup has been special. I learnt about countries like Zaire for the first time back in World Cups, and it was fantastic. Right? So 40 years from now, I think you said it a couple of times, FIFA has become synonymous with corruption. They've managed to create a relatively bad image of themselves. Where will the World Cup be in 40 years? Can they break it? Is this kind of a tipping point where we are today between what was the World Cup and what the World Cup will be, which is this very commercial corruption?
Yeah, I mean, you could stuff it with so many bad teams that people stop caring. And of course, that does happen with sports. So baseball used to be the most popular sport in the United States. Rowing was the celebrity sport of the 19th century. So, yeah, sports rise and fall. I mean, soccer does have this amazing quality that means that for 150 years, it lands in a new territory, whether that's Argentina or, Zambia, and people think, wow, this is brilliant. And so it's proved its ability geographically, it's proved its staying power over time. So professional football will survive us all, but it's true the World Cup might devalue itself.
We can't finish on that desperately uncheery note, surely. Do you have something uplifting to add? Thank you. Yes, Jill.
Thanks. I haven't read the book, obviously. But
no.
Sorry about that.
That's not good enough.
But do you cover the Women's World Cup at all?
So I thought about this. I've been to one Women's World Cup here. And in my defense, it's partly because no media has ever paid me to write about or attend a Women's World Cup. So I thought, how can I write a book about the World Cup and only write about the Men's World Cup? And then I thought, if I write a bit about my experience at the one Women's World Cup I've been to, it'd be very tokenistic. And somebody else should write a book about the Women's World Cup. That was how I resolved it in the end. This is a book about the Men's World Cup, which is popularly known as the World Cup. which is wrong, and somebody else will write a book about the Women's World Cup, and I will happily read it. The thing is, the Women's World Cup starts in the 90s, and it's growing very rapidly, so that in countries like France and England, the women's national team's viewing figures in the first round are now similar to the men's national team viewing figures. It's really up there. And I was in England when they won the Euro final on penalties last year. And, the whole country was totally into it. So I really think that the catch-up has been much faster than anyone could have anticipated.
Plus, of course, it was a miracle because England won a match on penalties.
Well, and the penalty she hit, I mean, you could see she really, really wanted to take the penalty, and she crashes this penalty, and it was faster shot, I think, than any in the men's Premier League that season. It's amazing.
Amazing. Just like this book, World Cup Fever by Simon Kuper.